Welcome to Native Calgarian and Mossy for listening. I'm your host, Michelle Robinson, speaking to you in Mohkinstsis in the Blackfoot Confederacy, home of the Niitsitapi, Tsuut'ina Dene, and the Yiharhi Nakota. I talk about history, current news, unheard news, book clubs, with special guests to give local or national issues a voice through an urban Satu Dene lens. My life's work will be to honor the voices of my ancestors and next generation with humor, love, and truth. Reconciliation is work, not performance. May we honor all Indigenous voices with that courage. Today is October 22nd, 2024. Welcome to Native Calgarian. If you enjoy hearing Indigenous content by this Satu Dene woman, my Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. Also, giving a review helps, whatever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe, or you can go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. And always remember to share things you learned to your network. Oki. Naganago Nekocheche Stapom Aki, or Nara Daga the Kots Nagotene Siku Saradi. So I tried to say my name, Red Thunder Woman, in first Blackfoot to acknowledge the land I'm in, and then in my language, Satu Dene, to acknowledge who I am. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use they, them pronouns. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake tribe in Treaty 11 in Delaney. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene nation is uninvited to this area of Pincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many big dog town, named after the Calgary Stampede. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot, Mohkinstsis, as Michelle Elliott, an English name which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. Acknowledging proximity to whiteness is important because the darker the skin, the more racism a person experiences in colonial spaces. My late great-grandfather, geez, I finally got that out, is Milo Bewell from Deline. His daughter, Alice, is my now late granny. My mother and I are Northern Slavey Dene, or Satu Dene. My Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellow Knives Dene First Nation. Through my father, I am the daughter of a Mayflower and the daughter of the American Revolution. Having a Canadian Indian Act imposed status card is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous peoples' inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit, or the Indigenous LGBTQ community, and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the Canadian socio-economic ladder because of colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. According to the Quality of Life Report of 2024 from the Calgary Foundation, life is harder if you're part of a racialized group. 42% of members of a racialized group do not have timely access to culturally appropriate healthcare and well-being services. 40% of members from a racialized group can't find suitable employment, which is up from 31% from last year. I am not a social worker, nor an elder, excuse me, nor do I speak on behalf of all Indigenous people, but I share my journey as a Dene mother and woman navigating this colonial, ableist, misogynistic, racist world in 2024. As a trauma-informed Dene woman who has attempted to run harmful colonial parties, spent money to be at expensive conventions, left my home to travel to those conventions just to vote on incomplete policies that still allow for colonial incarceration, a denial of justice, denial of health services, racism, colonial trauma, genocide of Black and Indigenous peoples. I have work to continue, reports to advocate for, and attempt to work within these systems meant to harm me and my community. I think of all of this today, and I hope we honor the many Indigenous lives lost for the so-called country named Canada. I hope you see your role in the importance of stopping harm, and as a citizen, see your role in reconciliation, and as a treaty partner. Pride Month should never be 1 month. It is important to understand that the straight agenda and gendered violence was and is forced on these lands by Christian outsiders. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as a guest, and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner in a so-called time of reconciliation. Can they be performative? Of course. It's important land acknowledgements have meaning. Otherwise, you're just creating more harm. I encourage all people to introduce themselves with an acknowledgement of their ancestors, stories of displacement, how you perceive your role as a treaty partner, a citizen of Canada, a refugee, or other land displacement, so we as Indigenous peoples know how safe you are to be around. If you won't pronounce your local Indigenous nations' names, if you won't say your pronouns, you won't say your story of origin, won't acknowledge stolen lands, won't acknowledge economic oppression or your role in reconciliation, I determine how safe you are to be around my community, my family, and myself because we face the most colonial violence based on ignorance or worse, willful anti Indigenous biases. Understanding land acknowledgements and their importance is Indigenous 101 because it immediately addresses colonialism, oppression dynamics, broken treaties, and lies taught today in schools nationally. That's why settlers and those who call themselves Native Calgarians or whatever town you're from, you show me you have no Indigenous 101 understanding. Jesse Winte's book Unreconciled explains that perfectly, as do many Indigenous authored books. Land Back is a movement that could save the planet from climate change created by colonialism and capitalism, but it would be a part of a treaty partnership, part of meaningful reconciliation, and honoring global initiatives like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As a former geomatics drafter, I'd be happy to teach you more, but you'd have to pay me. Go to nativecalgarian.com for more. So I want to welcome a good friend of mine who I'm so happy to have here today. I want to talk about a billion things with my friend, but I will allow you to introduce yourself and then we will chat from there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. So my name is Bryan Crockett. I use he, him pronouns or they, them pronouns. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Sinimu people, in what is colonially known as Nanaimo. And I am also a visitor to these lands, despite being an Indigenous person myself. I'm Métis, I'm Red River Métis, but my family has been displaced from Manitoba, Saskatchewan. And in about the 60s and 70s, my grandmother had moved to northern BC, along with many other Métis people. So we've been displaced by colonialism in that way, but being here on these lands as a guest, definitely affords me quite an amount of colonial privilege in that I'm mostly white passing. I'm Métis, so I have that European ancestry and those traditions and those cultural norms to draw on. And where other people who are Indigenous who aren't perhaps as white passing as me, they might not have that privilege. So I definitely want to recognize that. And I also want to recognize that my grandmother, who was displaced, Blanche Hurry, also known as Blanche Lucier at different points in her life, she was displaced from those lands, and she had to deal with the trauma and didn't necessarily have the tools and the support around her to do that. So at different points, that has been a challenging story where lateral violence is involved and different, even personal self-determination and senses of identity have been involved. So in my family, luckily, thanks to my grandmother and my mother, Sharon Thomas, there's been a lot of reclaiming of that identity and learning about being Métis, and not just being Métis, but being Red River Métis, and the complexities of the Métis world, and what it's like to exist in these Indigenous spaces, while being still a visitor. And personally, I feel like I have quite an attachment to these lands through my stepfather, who is Cowichan. And he's Cowichan, but not Sanimu, but because the region is and has always been fairly close, and they're both Ho'okaminam speaking peoples. We have relations in this area, and well, my stepdad does, but I say we because he's the man who raised me. And it's it's a place that feels like home and in many ways is home, but is also something that I need to recognize that um, it being the home of myself and other people who benefit from colonialism can take away from the rights and title and inherent right of Sinimu people to reside here in their own lands. So I'm definitely grateful for the opportunity to work here and to speak with you from these lands, but I also
Amazing.
recognize that it's a tremendous privilege to be able to do so.
Oh, I feel
Um,
you so much on that.
and it's one of those complexities too, because there's a tradition of indigenous people in particular acknowledging their ancestry when they speak and when they're being introduced. And that has, for many people, and myself included, complications related to colonialism, where I don't really have a relationship with my birth father's family, bearing a couple of my uncles. We've recently reconnected, so that's been nice.
Sure.
But the complexity as well, where my stepfather has been the man who raised me, and I've been fully integrated into that side of the family, and to the point where I get invited to events and people are shocked that I'm not his biological child, and they're shocked that I don't have a status card and that the status card doesn't say Cowichan on it. And it's just an interesting kind of juxtaposition of identity. So where colonialism has taken a lot of opportunity from my family to really decide who we are and to track our own family because of everything ranging from the destruction of documents to that kind of deep-seated pain that people have to go through when their identity is one that is actively being discriminated against and is actively being attacked by the Canadian state. So it's always something that for me personally, I'm glad that people do it, and I'm glad that people acknowledge their ancestry, but it's also one of those situations where it it opens up these complexities that we don't often see. And that's why I love talking about it, but
Yep.
it's never a short answer.
No, that's the whole thing. And like I was saying to you, depending on where people are and understanding this, it's a hard conversation to have because, like, you obviously understand colonialism, but I would say a lot of my guests don't really. Like, they understand colonialism has hurt them, but maybe not to the extent that you have. And I think you and I could take a real deep dive into, traditional adoption and why you
Mhm.
should have your status and why the band needs to properly adopt you. Like, we could have that conversation, but you and I know it's clouded under the Indian Act, and I just don't
Mhm.
think other people quite get this whole conversation. And then, and it's hard too because, like, as my dad is white, and he got full custody of us, because of that. I didn't go to Indian residential school, and my brother didn't go to Indian hospitals when he got into a car accident. He went to the Alberta Children's Hospital. So, like, there's a complexity there where it's like, if my dad wasn't there, if he wasn't advocating for me, where would I be here right now at all? Probably not. Right. So, like, there's a
Mhm.
big conversation to have about something so simple as that. And then, like, my stepmom is from Calgary. So through her, I'm a second generation Calgarian. But, like, as you so eloquently talked about being indigenous and displaced from your homeland and being a guest in somebody else's indigenous lands, like, that is a real thing. And that's why I think it's funny. I was having a conversation with one of our local drummers at this science conversation, and he said, "Introduce me to you." And so I said, "Oki nagana go meko che takomaki dakots nagot tene siku." And I said, so I tried to say Red Thunder Woman in Blackfoot, but I also said my name in my language, but I still have to read, like, in Blackfoot, you have to say Oki Naganago. That means hello, my name is. And in my language, like, there's a little preamble that I have to reread, and I have to get used to
Mhm.
saying it. And then it ends with, like, Meradi or something as well. So it kind of all flows together, but I'm not good at flowing it yet. So I sound like a really bad Southern person speaking our language, right?
I always, when it comes to language, that's one of the areas that I just have never, unfortunately, been lucky enough to have resources to learn. And then now that I do have the resources to learn, time is one of those resources where I try to make time to learn Michif, but
It's
it's
tough.
one of those things that, well, and especially the the kind of conversations that people have in a day-to-day basis,
Mm.
the hey, how are you, how was work, how's your family, those conversations are so critical for learning language, but without anyone around to speak Michif with, I don't have that opportunity. And the people who are around to speak Michif with, kind of three complications come up, and one of them is that I don't want to use their time for free.
Sure.
I have a very strong, if you're getting something of value from someone, you got to pay them. And even if that's, just a mutual exchange of time, then that's one way of paying. But also, you got to recognize that what they're doing has worth. That's been taught to me, that is an extremely important part of my culture, as I understand it. And so that's one point. The second point is that these speakers of language often learn a set of conversational styles that are very conductive to like certain kinds of conversations. They're very good for like filling out a form, or they're very good for saying things like, "This is your breakfast. Would you like to sit at the table?" And everyone's got to start somewhere, but I always just find it so hard to engage with those resources when it's like, I'm like, I don't, when in my life do I ask someone if they want to sit at a table? I want to ask someone like, how's your family doing? How's, that kind of stuff. And then the third point that I say, that I often feel like I don't have the spoons myself at this exact moment to really dedicate the energy that the language deserves to it. So I don't want to take the resource person away from someone who does have those resources right now.
Yeah.
Um, so it's complex, but
No, and you
I'm
know
I'm
what?
definitely one of those Métis people that just the I sometimes start an email with Tanchi, and that is the extent of my Michif.
No, I think that's great, honestly. And like there is a lot to be said about that. And I've talked about, okay, so kind of to your first point, like, a lot of people who are indigenous are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder because we don't fit in quite the same, right? Like we just don't, we're just not the same. So and so
Hmm.
we don't get hired first, we get fired, all of those things, right? And then the other point that you're talking about, like what is so frustrating to me, and I had a really good friend of mine from this area, and he talked to the prime minister on the CBC and outright said to him, why isn't the money that was invested into Indian residential schools nationally, why isn't that same money today used to not like to help people learn their language? Like, why aren't we investing into that the same amount? So, and so for someone like me who, like, I'm 47, I have a daughter who's about to go into post-secondary after this year, about to graduate high school. How do I have time to learn my language, teach her while they have to
Hmm.
be in this colonial world under the colonial economic system? Like it to people not understand those oppression dynamics. Like it's like I can't even have this conversation with you if you can't see that. So I fully respect where you're coming from with that, and I wish that we could all understand that and start kind of working on those things. But we are where we're at, and what I am happy is
Hmm.
that talking about ADHD with you
Hmm.
online a bit and sharing some of that, like it's so great to have people who understand to talk to because I'm struggling. I'm struggling at, well, first I should say, I had a lot of childhood trauma. And from that, I've always been in counseling. So I learned a lot of coping
Hmm.
tools and strategies to deal with that since, I'm 47 now. So I've managed. So that's part of the biggest reason why I didn't know I had ADHD and possibly autism. But that bigger thing now, I'm trying to like, is this complex post-traumatic stress disorder? Is this childhood trauma? Is this ADHD? Is this just colonial ableism?
Yeah. Well, and the colonial ableism can be the trauma. And
Yeah.
that's I think what a lot of people struggle with understanding.
Hmm.
Like they almost don't give themselves permission to see it as what it is.
Yep. Yep. I
I know
agree.
that with my ADHD situation, like it definitely resonates with what you were saying with that I've always mostly managed. I've always looking back, there's always been signs that I had ADHD and I would hyperfixate on things. And I've literally never been able to keep a clean house or bedroom. And I know where absolutely everything is on the floor, so don't move it. And
Yep.
all of those kind of things, and all of the way that I interact more calmly and fluidly with people who are neurodivergent, and also being um, I've been told by my doctor that I'm very probably on the autism spectrum, but that in my personal situation, it's not necessarily a priority to dive into that aspect, and I agree with that. But just knowing that and looking back at all these moments of going, oh, maybe the reason why I stood out really weirdly at that conference is because I wasn't picking up on all of the social cues of what to do. And oh, maybe the reason why I'm terrified of being in a room where where there's lots of people mingling unless I have a job is an autism thing.
Hmm.
So it's been really interesting to learn that about myself. And then I also had that kind of self-gaslighting where because I'm a relatively high functioning person, and I hate that like high functioning, but in terms of in terms of meeting some basic needs and meeting some like needs that exist in a colonial society, like being able to pay my rent and sustain a job and that sort of thing. I definitely can, for the most part, manage those functions, or at least I could before my brain injury. And having a lot of friends who have more disorder in their lives from their autism or their ADHD had me thinking I couldn't possibly have ADHD because it affects so and so like that, and that's ADHD, not what I do. That couldn't possibly be. So there was a lot of like relearning and kind of examining myself from a different lens after my doctor had told me that I had ADHD, because how that conversation even happened was following the brain injury that I had in 2022. One of the follow-up appointments with my doctor, we were talking about symptoms of what I thought was depression. And I do have depression, but those particular symptoms that I was having, where I just was not motivated, it was impossible to motivate me to do anything. I was having no ability to do tasks. And she said, I think this is your ADHD getting worse because of the brain injury. And I said, I have ADHD. So that was an interesting point with her, where she had always had it on her mind for me, but because it had never been raised to my doctor as an ongoing problem, we had never complained about my executive function as a kid or anything like that. Um, I had issues, but they just didn't make it to my doctor,
Sure.
and so she never brought it up. But it just kind of winds up as one of those situations where I'm like, if I had got that Vyvanse earlier, how would my life be different?
Right? It's so funny because I'm still going down the journey of trying different type of medication. So first I went on Concerta, a
Mm,
generic form apparently, and then I went on Adderall, a generic form again apparently. And so that's where I'm at right now, and I'm not really finding them to be helpful. And so kind of adding in some more extra is I had COVID, and I had a good friend who said to me, it's like when you hard reset a computer and you like erase all of your coping tools and have to start over. And I was like, oh my God. that's exactly, and I just assumed it was childhood trauma, but now that I'm understanding it was likely ADHD, looking at it very differently in that way. And then, you know, and kind of mad. I've been really angry actually, because like in my teens, I was court ordered to go to counseling because my stupid parents were dealing with their stupid divorce and couldn't be civil about it enough to, like they would fight with lawyers, right? So
Hmm.
I was like this little ping pong before they gave like children human rights. And so
Yeah.
I was going to a counselor to basically, the one lawyers wanted me to say I want to see my mom, and these lawyers wanted me to not say that, so that's kind of where it was. So from there, and then in my 20s, I had my own voluntary counseling to try to understand things. And I've always had it. When I had my daughter in my 30s, I had a really like systemic racist traumatic event because
Hmm.
I was red flagged in the system as a status Indian, right? And I thought, as a person who is drafting wells and pipelines and, happily married to my husband and going scuba diving in Nanaimo for vacation, that I was, not one of those natives that I was taught for the
Hmm.
30 years beforehand by my racist family. So, so I had a lot of unlearning to do once I hit 30, right? And then we crossed paths not too long after that as well. And yeah, I've been in counseling all my life, and not one single counselor brought it up. Uh, have you thought that maybe it was this? And then again, like it's because like that childhood trauma, that all that stuff was kind of like intermingled, right? So I just
Hmm.
never thought I was even a little bit autistic or ADHD. But yet now in retrospect, obviously, who were all my friends? They were
Yeah.
the people who had brilliant things to say or thought about life a little different. And we could go in four different directions, like bang, 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 and it be we're all on the same page, like understanding that now.
Exactly. Where now you look at it and can think, oh yeah, that's a bunch of people in some way who are neurodivergent, and we tend to find each other. Um, that's that's such a the anger piece that you mentioned is such a point that resonates with me because there's kind of there's two aspects to that that really hit home. The first is very colonial, and it's that when I was younger, when I was in kindergarten, I apparently was not apparently, I was from reading the documentation. I was extremely disinterested in kindergarten. I would cooperate, but like I didn't want to be there. You know me, I've never been able to tell people that if I don't want to be somewhere, people know.
Yeah,
So,
right.
even as a 5-year-old or 6-year-old, that was the situation. So my mom had saved privately, and she was a single mom at that point, struggling with an alcohol abuse disorder. So she took her quite a bit of her resources to save for a private assessment for me to have a psychometric assessment done. And we met with this psychologist, and I just remember that I went into a room with an old man and he asked me a whole bunch of questions, and if I got them right, he started giving me M&Ms. And then I figured out that if I ignored his question and pretended I didn't hear it, that he would give me more M&Ms when I finally answered it correctly. And now, as an adult, um, going in to get my bachelor's degree and choosing psychology as the field of study, I'm learning about what those assessments were. And I go, oh, that was the screening for developmental challenges or autism or ADHD or all these other things. Why wasn't that picked up? So I brought that up with my mom, and we started talking about what that experience was like in terms of my perspective as a kid getting tested,
Yeah.
um, and then from her perspective, where she really didn't know what was going on. I was a gifted kid who had behavior issues, and I had a lot of issues writing with a pen, and I couldn't sit still, and I was really quick to escalate conflict. So those kind of things um, are all ADHD traits now that I'm saying them. But at the time, she just wanted to make sure that there was nothing wrong, so to speak.
Hmm.
So the psychologist had reassured her, quite rightly, that there was nothing wrong.
Yeah.
So she took the report that he wrote, and my mom is an exceptionally smart person, one of the smartest people I know. She's just not somebody who is a person who has the knowledge required to read a psychologist's report. So she took the report, scanned it herself, and it looked like nothing was wrong. So then she filed it away. And now, as an adult reading that, and at 6 years old, this psychologist had identified that I had the traits associated with autism and at the time, Asperger's. Um, but I cannot make a diagnosis because I'm not a medical doctor. And then he did diagnose me with then ADD, but that diagnosis didn't actually get properly communicated to my mom, so then it didn't get communicated to the doctor. And my mom, with the things that she was dealing with at that time, like there's only so much capacity that a person has. So I absolutely don't fault her for that. But it's one of those situations where it's like, we could have known.
Right.
Um,
And you know what really upset me is to find out anxiety and depression are side effects of undiagnosed ADHD. And this whole time I just thought, but everybody does this. Everybody feels this. Everybody feels anxious. Everyone goes through depression. And it's like, but you're more susceptible if you have ADHD and it's undiagnosed. And
it was
so
amazing. I'm sorry.
yeah, no, I'm with you. I just wish you knew, like I'm so frustrated because like now here I am as an adult, and I had 17 years with my girl. And if I would have
Mm,
known for 17 years, I could have helped her. I could have taught her. Because it was
mm,
really weird for me to see this child showing some of the same traits that I have when I
mm,
associated it all with childhood trauma. I'm like, okay, so you didn't experience this, or this, yet you're still showing anxiety and depression. Like how, why?
mm,
And so that's what really, like, and her generation, oh my God, they all are good with this. Like there's no
mm,
stigma at all. They all know each other have ADHD and autism. They're all very loving, accommodating, and they understand consent like nothing. Like I can't
because
like
it's so normalized.
it's so normalized for their generation. So a lot of her friends who do have ADHD were saying to her, you know, that is ADHD traits. She suspected she had it a little longer. And so I
Mm,
feel bad for not, and she's like, and nobody wants me to feel bad. And I know that. And I know
mm,
from my, belief system of, always challenge negative self-talk that I shouldn't be
mm,
thinking that, but I haven't got past that yet. Like I haven't made peace with it yet. So I'm not there yet, but at the same time, I know um, I just wish I would have taught her these tools. That's
yeah.
that's my regret that I had her for 17 years and now she has to live a life of her having to learn this journey. And I guess like that's okay. We all have to learn our journey, right? Like I had to learn how to get
And
along with my husband in my 20s and stuff, right? So we all have our
and
journeys. Yeah.
exactly, and it's nice that she can benefit from your journey as well. Where I've had that, like with my mom, she was just recently diagnosed with ADHD as well, and she wasn't diagnosed. She's not on any medication or anything like that with it, but her diagnosis for her wasn't it wasn't a surprise, but it just made a whole lot of stuff start to make sense.
Yeah.
And I think what you were saying with the anger, that's definitely something that I've heard from a lot of my other neurodivergent friends, especially Indigenous people, where it's not anything you can really like do something about, but it's there and it has to be acknowledged because otherwise it just that can really turn into something negative. So I'm definitely with you there on feeling it, and I try not to shy away from it, but I try to use it for something productive.
You know, the like 2 days after I finally got my assessment done and they said, yeah, I had time with elders and they were really great
Mhm.
about it. And they just didn't act like it was a thing at all. They were like, they
Mhm.
said, well, Michelle, you're you. And that's enough. That's okay. And like my name is Red Thunder Woman, right? So like there's always that truth telling. and they told me when I got my name that if you quit, being honest and truthful, like, and you quit speaking, then
Hmm.
your name may change. And it's not that I want to keep my name at the end of the world until the end of time. It's just that because I've seen other elders go through 3 or 4 names and like
Hmm.
their lifetime. It's just that bigger picture that like I know this is who I am, and I now that I understand it might be rooted in that autism and ADHD. And then understanding, like back to what you're saying about that term high functioning, like understanding the reason why it's always been so hard and why burnout is so hard. It's because you know there's the assumption of high functioning when it's really you're working 3 times harder, and it doesn't have to be. So what I've done is I've told myself, like, yes, you can do 4 events in a day, of course you can, but you can't anymore. You need to do one. And so I've been really limiting myself on one thing a day so that that way I don't have extreme burnout. And maybe one day if I feel regulated again, like we're fully regulated, maybe I'll see if taking on more than one will be okay. But even then, I think then it's taking a chance. And because I'm 47, the average lifespan for an Indigenous woman in Alberta is 68. So I only
Hmm.
have 20 years. So I just don't know if I'll ever do it again. So I don't want to risk it. I only have 20 years with my daughter, and I don't want it to be, even partly dysregulated. So,
Yeah.
it's a hard thing to understand, and I wish I would have understood it sooner. But I am who I am, and I'm here now, and you
And
know,
to find your new balance to it
yeah.
too.
Mm-hmm.
That's because I know with myself, when I was a lot more active in partisan politics and I was doing law on the side and advocacy work in Indigenous organizing and these different things, people would constantly say to me, like, Bryan, what the hell? Why are you doing so many different things? And like, I basically lived out of a suitcase because for one, it kept opportunities open because if someone was like, "Hey, we're gonna go door knock in this other riding, and then we're all gonna stay the night," well, I already had my stuff in my bag ready to go. And then the other aspect was that I was just traveling so much with work, and I kept so busy. But looking back, I kept so busy because that was how I was keeping my brain stimulated, and it was an ADHD thing. And now, um, having a brain injury that I'm mostly back to being stable and able to do certain things but not others. It's very weird to have these new limits because I'm coming back to myself and finding that I'm able to do so many things the same way that I could before, but like in 2016, Bryan could have gone and done 4 or 5 events in a day, slept on someone's couch for 2 hours, and then gone and done 4 or 5 events the next day, and
Yep.
then flew in a plane for 8 hours, and then 4 more events. And that if I didn't keep that pace, then I would burn out.
Yep.
But now I can do one of those days, but then I need like the next 2 days to be very low to
Same.
recover.
Yep.
And it's learning that limit has been strange.
Oh my God, I am so grateful because like you and I were like knew each other quite well at that time when you and I were
Mm,
doing way too much. And everybody said those things to us like, wow, where do you guys have the
exactly.
energy? It's because we have undiagnosed ADHD. That's all time. I didn't know. And I laugh because too, like you're about brain injury. I feel like that's what COVID was for me, but it's not
Hmm.
properly diagnosed. It never will be. Um,
Hmm.
Regardless, it's just that it forced me to be like, wow, this is not right. Like it just changed the way I see everything. And I don't know if I'll ever fully get it back, that's for sure. But it is one of those things that has affected me in such a strong, strong way. And I'm just glad to have other people understand what it is that I'm going through. Because
Hmm.
too, like it is hard when you're talking about colonialism, racism, and gendered violence, and the Indian Act, and you have well-meaning non-Indigenous people who don't understand the oppression, wanting to
Hmm.
help, but they just can't. They don't understand what it is we're going through. So I've been really hurting thinking of John Wells was a local fellow here, part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot Confederacy used to be at the Carriage House Inn doing a million things all the time. And he was having some sort of like, he needed help. And he asked the staff there, can you help me? So they called the police on him and they killed him. So now I
Oh my
keep
God.
thinking, like, I have to keep regulated for no other reason than if I have a panic attack or anxiety attack outside of my house, like, that's a really high
Mm.
volatile situation now. That's the wrong person could decide whether or not I continue the rest of that day. So I think about that a lot. I think about him and I think about if he was just experiencing what I was. And then I think about you and and I remember when you got your brain injury and you're talking about headaches a lot. And I felt really
Mhm.
bad because I have had headaches my entire life. Well, now I found out that that is undiagnosed ADHD. Like all
Mhm.
of that stress and trauma is like in you and you don't realize it, right? Like that so-called high functioning, that masking, that's headaches. That's the
Yeah.
tension.
And so much of your body using stress hormones instead of using other neurotransmitters.
Yes, and like,
Um,
and you were always talking about dopamine fixing. Well, like now that I
mhm.
have hormone changes, because I'm of that age where I'm starting to get
Mhm.
hot flashes, um, like I don't know if the hormones of that plus the COVID, like it's all kind of interconnected to making my brain go, wow, that's loud.
I re I really think that in the next few years, we'll wind up seeing medical specialists who specialize in treating people post-COVID, the same way that, there's diabetes specialists, the same way that there's specialists in other conditions,
Yep,
because the experiences that you're sharing are not exclusive, unfortunately. Like so many people are going through that, and so many people are going through that not realizing that it's from COVID or from long COVID or recovering from it or damage from it or whatever you want to term it as.
yep.
But so many people like are in that situation. And what you mentioned with was his name John Wells? Sorry, I just
Yeah, John Wells,
yeah,
and it's
yeah.
Jon, not an HN. He's a Jon. John Wells.
I think I remember. I'm terrible at remembering names, so I
Yeah,
think that I just couldn't. But what hearing about his story kind of brings to mind in like a selfish personal way, but like in 2017 when I was going from working in provincial politics to going and working in federal politics, at one of those points they wanted to switch the antidepressant that I was taking. So yeah, it made sense. So I did the switch. But at some point in that switch, I had the first panic attack of my life.
mm,
I had no idea what it was. I thought that I was having a heart attack. I thought that I was dying.
yeah,
And then like that's the rational brain
yep,
being like, oh, like this stuff is scary. And then the emotions as well to deal with all of that. So
yeah,
I went to the emergency room because, my heart was pounding and all this kind of stuff. And I remember just sitting there, very calmly, very like focusing on masking and projecting as much calm as I could because I'm 6'5". I have resting bitch face. Like I don't want people to think that I'm some big angry guy. And
yeah,
especially because I was terrified with everything happening.
sure,
And then I had to get a copy of those notes for a legal correspondence. I had to get a copy of my chart from that day.
sure.
And one of the care providers had written beside my name as they were doing their examination, they had written large indigenous or not, they wrote large Aboriginal, and then they underscored Aboriginal. And I'm thinking, at no point did that come up.
Yep,
How was that? And I pursued this with complaints, and the situation was resolved, and the person was trying to be well-meaning, and it was an opportunity for them to get further training, which they did receive. But it was a situation that makes me think all the time, like if any number of things had gone wrong, I could have died in that ER
yeah,
because I was dysregulated. Someone might have thought that I was on illicit drugs, or someone might have thought that I was
yeah,
drunk or that I was being too combative. And I remember in that moment too, like an elder, not like an indigenous elder, but like an older person was coming in and needed to sit beside their spouse. And the most logical thing for to happen in that moment while I was having that panic attack would be for me to give up the seat that I was in for them. And I agreed with that like contemporaneously. I thought, okay, I'm in this space. It would there's a space over there that I can go to. It's not going to be as easy for those two to go to that space, so I'm going to give up my space.
Yeah.
So just I had anchored myself so much to sitting in that chair,
Yeah.
and my the calmness I was projecting was from the position that I was in. So as soon as I had to move, it was like, all right, I'm leaving. And I didn't mean to look like I was blowing up. And
Sure.
then I thought to myself afterwards, I was like, someone external to that situation who has that prejudice
Mhm.
could think that there's an angry Indian.
Yeah.
Like, and,
100%.
and the fact that I've reviewed medical charts of my mom where she's met with different specialists for the various things that she's gone through in her life, and indigenous or aboriginal has always been noted for some reason,
Yeah.
and it like even when it's not clinically relevant.
Of
And
course.
it's like she's less white passing than me, but like
Yeah.
at the same time, you know, lady is here to talk about a slipped disc in her back. Like, I don't know if her indigeneity is clinically relevant to put in her chart. And like you were saying, like create that flag almost.
And it is like they immediately treat you different as soon as they know you're native. Like at that time, I wasn't a proud native when I had my daughter.
Hmm.
I know you and I both joke about being white passing, but we're actually not.
Hmm.
And then when we're out in with white people and they see us, like they know, and because I'm status, like they knew. And so,
Hmm.
um, like I've actually had to tell my daughter because she really wanted her status, and it was William Sinclair out of, or Murray Sinclair out of all people who said on my Facebook, like, you better get her status. So I was really
Hmm.
big on consent, finally got her status. And, but I had to tell her, look, man, status isn't a privilege. What it is, it's a recognition of who you are, but it's a permission now for Stephen Harper's to take your list of from the Indian Affairs and give it to CSIS. From here on
Hmm.
in, it's permission for you to experience extreme prejudice at the hospital in your most vulnerable moment. And so when she understood that, and like, and she's heard horrid stories, obviously through my podcast. I've talked to
Hmm.
many folks, and them share horrible stories about what has happened to them. I told her, "Are you sure? Really sure that's what you want?" Because if I wouldn't have been a status native, I probably wouldn't have experienced what I experienced. Now,
Hmm.
that's wrong thinking. That's colonial thinking. I'm mad at myself for ever thinking that way. Now that I know who I am and I understand what happened, I'm very proud of who I am. But I just needed her to understand, like, you really have a choice here. And I've
Hmm.
also told them, both my husband and my daughter, like, you recognize that when I have a stroke or a heart attack, I am going to be mistreated and will die prematurely at a young age for something totally treatable had I been white. And so the fact I've had to make peace with that, let alone prepare my
Hmm.
family for that, right? We had a candidate who ran in our area, and her dad was an immigrant, and we all called this local hospital the death hospital. And she said we can spend $30,000 on a lawsuit that we likely won't win, or can spend $30,000 on a campaign. And so she chose to put her money there, and her family did as well. And so I think about that a lot. I think about how many people who are unfairly treated in our area, and that how you have to prepare for that as a result. And sadly, I see that with my stepmom. My stepmom is Austrian,
Hmm.
so she's white, like she is white. But because her
Hmm.
parents are Austrian and have a very thick accent, um, you know, we see that racism, anti-immigrant racism here. Yeah,
It's
sucks.
Well, in healthcare too, my most recent employment experience that
Wow.
ended somewhat recently because of some issues related to a disability that are currently in litigation, and I won't discuss those
Sure.
issues further. But I was working in a pharmacy, and we were on Cowichan land, like on the Indian Act recognized reserve land, because the
Sure.
whole town is Cowichan land, but this is the reserve.
Yeah.
And the manager of the pharmacy who I was working with is a gentleman who's white, but he's especially passionate about social justice
Oh,
and
good.
passionate about what he can do from his perspective as a pharmacist
Hmm.
to empower Indigenous people in that pharmacist client relationship.
Sure.
And one of the things that he found was um, particularly helpful was the indigenous people who worked in the pharmacy had these relationships with the clients that would come in, like, that person that's your sister, your friend,
Yeah.
we knew everyone was related to us in some way, in the very indigenous small town kind of way.
Yeah.
But the pharmacist Dean, he in a lot of ways would get out of the way, and he would let um Darcy Joe is one of the people who was doing this work, and I was doing this work. He would let us basically be the first point of contact with someone coming in. So someone might come in and say, my kid has head lice, and then we can discuss that in a culturally appropriate way.
Sure.
And then I'm not a healthcare professional by any training or anything like that. So, and
Sure.
neither is Darcy. And what we would do would be we'd go to the pharmacist afterwards and we'd be like, here's what came up in our conversation. Here is what you did last time in this situation. There you go. So then we would type it into the computer for him. The pharmacist would look everything over and he'd make sure that everything was clinically and pharmaceutically appropriate. And
Sure.
then he would go and have a conversation with the client and make sure that everything was appropriate. And then he'd sign off on it. And then they would get the head lice treatment for free because he's a prescriber.
Nice.
And so many other things are possible like that because of kind of a confluence of factors. Like in one of the complications of people having Indian Act imposed status compared with just Indigenous identity is then you're federal in jurisdiction
Hmm.
because of Section 9124 of the British North America Act. Your Indians and lands reserved for the Indians are a federal jurisdiction exclusively. So the provinces don't have that involvement in healthcare in the regular way. And First Nations in BC are in a bit of a different situation compared with First Nations in other parts of the country for the most part,
Sure.
given the lack of treaties or treaties at various modern treaties at different stages and different stuff like that. So
Sure.
they started First Nations Health Authority, who took ownership of a lot of the non-insured health benefits that are available to status Indians. And what was happening beforehand was people needed a prescription from a doctor, or they needed to go through all of these colonial processes before they could actually actualize their benefits,
Yeah.
before they could take their inherent right and turn it into some medicine. And what BC did was they made it, okay, well, you need over-the-counter medicine. We're not going to make you go see a doctor for that. You can go talk to the pharmacist.
Yeah.
And all these pharmacists are thinking, oh, well, we don't want to do that because it's extra work for us. And we have to fill out an extra form. And
Yeah.
oh, it's my name going on that as a prescription. How do I know that they're not abusing these Tums or this Pedialyte? And these are actual conversations I've had with regulated pharmacists.
Same.
And
Both the Narcan, actually.
yes, I was going to
Jane.
bring that up.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where like First Nations Health Authority
Yeah.
put out a notice that says both kinds of like the Narcan that's injection is just
Guys, can you
free in
check the
BC.
messenger? Sorry.
No problem.
Shit. I thought
Uh,
I hit mute.
no
Shit.
problem. The Narcan that is by injection is just free at any pharmacy, that you
Supposed
can
to
just
be.
go and pick it up. And it's supposed to be, it is like that in BC, and for the most part, pharmacies follow those rules. But the Narcan, that's the nasal spray, First Nations Health Authority, because of having that decision-making sovereignty that they took back from Ottawa, were able to decide that they wanted the nasal spray to be covered, and they put out a notice about it, and we were putting them through because that one pharmacist was going, well, they say it's covered, they say I can do it, I'm going to do it. And nowhere else in town were people able to get that without a doctor's prescription, because all of these gatekeepers had stood in the way and, had their colonial understandings of professional liability, which, by the way, my legal opinion is that they were wrong about that
Yep.
anyway. um and they have their colonial understandings about, oh, we have to do the paperwork and the documentation. But the paperwork and the documentation, you're right, prevention of death. Like, what is the indication for naloxone? Reversing an overdose. Like, it doesn't have to get more complicated. Does the person have a substance use disorder or not? That's not relevant, because they might not even be the one who the naloxone gets used on.
I have tried so many times to explain this to people. It is so frustrating and so infuriating. Like I just don't even know how to talk about it anymore. And
Mhm.
I just know, even despite all of Dr. Jane Philpott's fantastic work to make it available, all of these systems have still figured out how to make it a barrier, how to be gatekeepers, as you
Mhm.
so eloquently talked about it. And I'm so grateful you did. I'm hoping that we can make that a clip, because it needs to be said more and more and more. And I wish that people understood it, but they don't. And I've had natives who are mad at me for distributing
Mhm.
Narcan. And I'm like, this literally could save someone's life. Like, you can't misuse it. You don't get a high from this. And the amount
Yeah,
of times,
exactly.
whether it's a pharmacist, whether it's a staff worker, whether it's a friend, do you have a substance use disorder? No, no, I just know this is the solution. And our people are dying on the streets. It's really
Mhm.
simple.
Exactly.
But I bet
And the
you people who
number,
are white don't get asked that.
well, and when I'm working in the pharmacy, if I have a patient who, there's certain guidelines where if they're picking up certain morphine milligram equivalents,
Sure.
someone is supposed to discuss Narcan or naloxone at some point with them.
Yeah.
And I'm not that someone, because I'm not a pharmacist or a technician or anything like that. But I'll ask them, have you had a chance to talk with the pharmacist yet about naloxone kits? They're free, by the way.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because a lot of people will get offended at that insinuation. And it's like, no, you are taking, like these overdoses can happen with illicit drugs, but they can also happen, your grandmother has stomach cancer and she takes Dilaudid, and she wasn't looking at the clock, and her pain was worse than normal, and she took an extra one, and
Yep.
that was enough. And
Yep.
that can be the situation. Or the situation can be that someone comes into their home and takes a substance, or so many different situations, or someone does use an illicit substance, and that person deserves to have their life saved as well.
A
And there's
hundred
no
percent. A hundred
and it
percent. And I tell people, you need to have one of these in your first aid kit, like you would hold a band-aid, like you would have in your
mhm.
purse, like a band-aid. Like it's the same thing. If you're walking around on the streets, you'll see people who need that. It's so simple, and
And
and then the other thing is too, like, it's that dignity when people come to your window and you don't have $5 to give them, but you can give them, or at least offer that, and they'll
mhm.
usually take it because they know what it is. And the nasal sprays are so much better than the stupid needle naloxone kits. But
Yeah,
I'm not discounting the importance of a naloxone kit. Don't get me wrong, but the nasal spray is just so easy to carry in a pocket,
it's
in a
so
purse.
easy and it's low barrier, which is the
Yeah,
nice thing.
so
There's
easy.
some clinical stuff that sciencey people understand better than I do, but I'm told that the injection one is like better from a clinical standpoint, but that better doesn't necessarily mean fully better if it doesn't get into the person.
Yeah.
Like the nasal is, if that's what you're comfortable using, then great. And it just like even literally today in one of my psychology classes, we were talking about the bystander effect
Mm,
and how people will assume that someone else has called 911 or people will assume that someone else will do first aid. And I brought up like, well, I've had first responder training and people who've had first responder training are statistically much more likely to intervene. So I've brought up, well, I've intervened before and I've administered naloxone and someone in my class was just like, "Hey, where do you get those?" So I said, "Oh, you can get them from a pharmacy, but here, I'll take the one that's dangling off my backpack and I'll give that to you."
yes,
Um, and one of the barriers that I've seen is pharmacies um rightly or wrongly wanting to make sure that it gets documented on someone's health profile,
I know.
but that creates the burdens that, and I am such a, I'm not going to say I'm pro conflict, but an ADHD thing, I've always been really good in conflict situations.
Yep.
It's probably why I'm a paralegal. And I am not someone to shy away from those conversations. So
Yep.
when I had a conversation with my doctor, where she brought it up, she said, "Hey," and my doctor is fabulous. She's great. She culturally informed care. She very much cares about us. She's fantastic. But she
Lucky.
she was like, "Hey, I am truly lucky, and my community is lucky to have her. She's incredible. Dr. Elliott from Duncan is phenomenal." But we had a conversation where she said, "I see these naloxone kits on your file. I just want to make sure that everything's okay." And I said, "Thank you for asking. I give them to people." And she's like, "Well, you know that goes on your health record." And I'm like, "Well, that's not my problem.
Mm,
I like if it gets pushed through and I have it in my backpack and someone needs it, I'm gonna give it to them."
mhm,
And I'm willing to have those conversations, and I have the privilege of being a legal professional where I'm equipped to have those fights
mhm.
and to explain the context around these things where a lot of other people aren't. So
Right.
I it might not be as much of a barrier in my particular situation, but for so many people, just having that documented is it's the same thing with STI tests
Hmm.
and how I mean actually it's a little bit of a different thing in my particular community being a gay man
Sure.
because every gay man I know has been tested in the last 6 months. You go and ask straight men and they've never been tested before and they're offended you would even ask.
Right.
But putting the straights aside for uh it's one of those things like STI tests even like they had that barrier where if your name went on it people wouldn't want to do it,
Right.
but as soon as they came up with all of the anonymous ways of getting that done now it's they've removed those barriers and that really needs to
Hmm.
happen with naloxone and with other harm reduction
God, I
and
want to
things like
talk
that.
all day with you, Brian, but I know we have to wrap this up, and I know I don't want to at all. I
Well,
miss
I'm
you.
definitely happy to come back.
I want to talk about this until like next time. I want to keep
uh,
going. So thank you so much for talking about all these things with me. And
and thank you for having me. This
you
has
know,
been something I've been wanting to do for a long time and I'm glad that it finally worked out.
you have to know though, like I feel so alone all the time. I feel alone all the time because you and some of the folks that are in our circle in our world, you
Mm,
understand what I'm talking about. You're understanding the Indian Act, colonialism, the advocacy, why it's wrong to deny Narcan, all of these things. You understand these things.
mm.
And it is so frustrating to me to feel so alone. And so I just wish you knew how validating this conversation was for me at that level, at the ADHD level, at the depression level, at the having a panic attack in public level. There was nothing here that I just didn't want to go, oh my God, I just feel so comfortable with you. And I
That
just
means a
so
lot.
yeah, I wish you knew. I don't get that feeling very often, and maybe that's why I keep going back to the place that we first met because, when I
Mm,
am together with you and some of our colleagues, I'm like I'm with my people. I know these people know what
mm.
I'm talking about. So and it's not the same online. Our Indigenous community is very fractured. There's
Yeah.
like over 634 of us, and so we all have different ideas and different opinions. And so, it doesn't feel very safe sometimes. So I just wish you knew
Hmm.
how much I miss you, how grateful I
I
am to
appreciate
have
that so
this
much. I miss you too.
conversation. Oh my God, I miss you so much. I hope we
And
cross paths here again in real life soon.
very soon, I hope. And
Yeah.
I have to say that from the advocacy you've done online and in person, and a lot of the behind the scenes conversations you've had, and the people that you've influenced who are other people in my life, like it's definitely something where I've learned more about these issues and learned more about how they affect people in real life because of the work that you're doing. So I definitely want to thank you for that.
Oh, I'm so happy. Every so often I need inspiration. This was it.
Same. This was, I feel very recharged.
Me too. Thank you, Bryan. Thanks for coming on the show. I am going to do my resources. So, I'm
Is it
really
okay
happy
if
you
I
take
quickly
care.
do a shameless plug?
100%. And please send it to me so I can make sure it's in the preamble.
Excellent. If people want to find out more about me, they can do so at bryancrockett.ca, where they can also subscribe to my newsletter. And some of my newsletter apparently auto publishes as a podcast, so you can subscribe to that too. I'm also the CEO of a new company that I started last month, which is a disability, accessibility, and equity, diversity, and inclusion informed communications and public relations firm. So it basically started because I was too disabled to have a regular job, so I made my own company to give myself a job. If you're interested in working with me, I can be reached in many ways, but you can always send me an email at bryan@bryancrockett.ca.
Amazing. Oh my God. Yes. I'm so excited to put that up. And I'm excited to sign up for your newsletter. So I hope you know.
Excellent. Uh, awesome.
Right on.
It's
Oh,
weird to
and
have actual people reading it now.
right. And now for everybody who's listening, Bryan is with a Y and Crockett is two T's. So when you put in bryancrockett.ca, remember that. Right on. Thanks, Bryan, so much for coming on. I so appreciate you.
Thank you.
Okay. I hope that you got to catch some of the things I was doing with WordFest. There is actually, as of today, and I haven't signed up yet for it, and I'm hoping by the time this broadcast airs that I will have gotten my ticket for Jody Wilson Rainbow coming back to Calgary through WordFest. We had a wonderful, wonderful session with Bob Kinesh Rice, and he graced us after putting down his kids for the night to come and join our book club. So really excited about that. And I found out through another book club member that the book that we did choose for November is actually in the Calgary Library, even though it's American. So that makes me happy. So I hope you consider joining the book club to learn about Indigenous issues in it with an Indigenous lens. And then, of course, there is the Reconciliation Action Group as well, and a Settler Book Club for folks who know enough to want to act. So I hope that you can consider joining those things. Just message me if you would like. I'm proud that this podcast has given solutions and included cultural safety training or cultural first aid in all of them to create a safer space for Indigenous, people of color, and those with a disability. The 2S LGBTQ are undergoing so much right now. So if you follow me on social medias, I am trying to amplify them. And I'm also trying to remind them that if they root their activism in 231 calls to justice, that together we will actually be able to be more inclusive in calling out transphobia. According to the 2024 Quality of Life report by the Calgary Foundation, 87% of members of a racialized group have experienced discrimination, while 50% of Calgarians claim to be committed to anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The stats are not showing that at all with the amount of discrimination we're facing. So you can find this at the Quality of Life report. Again, these are great resources for everybody. I want to say thank you to Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fritkin of hereto help.bc.ca of what is Indigenous cultural safety and why I should care about it. Their work and those cultural action tools are available. So please support Indigenous work like that as part of your reconciliation work and settler understandings. I'm just lucky enough to highlight and repeat it here. Internalized racism and lateral violence is another form of violence Indigenous and marginalized folks experienced by the structure of racism imposed on these lands, you can go to racialequitytools.org, where Donna Bevins has tons of resource files. Please don't hesitate to give her a donation. Do's and don'ts for bystander intervention by American Friends Service Committee. Lots of information about bystander intervention in general. If you see or experience racism here in Calgary, you can report it at acttoendracism.ca or text at 587-507-3838. Again, I'd like to amplify the City of Calgary's YouTube presentation on the journey of becoming an anti-racism leader. I want to also highlight Stop the Stack YYC. We have Black activists in this community that are absolutely being misjudged and misused and are spending tens of thousands of dollars on charges being stacked against them in hopes to break their spirit. And it's very upsetting because this is the justice system doing it to them. Indigenous have been talking about our issues as well, sharing our traumas in reports, commissions, and public hearings, just so it can be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties. Listen to politicians and their policies and platforms. If they don't recognize marginalized in their budget with Gender Equity Plus, if they're not putting money towards violence prevention programs, Indigenous education, sex education, lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities, know that your vote to that party directly negatively impacts marginalized people. And the 94 calls to action, the 231 calls to justice. We have the 113 pathways to justice that the Premier's Council is legitimately going against with this anti-trans legislation. And municipally, we have a white goose flying report, yet when you read it and you see the attempt to stop a safe consumption site, they're not reading it. This is gaslighting. And every institution in this country has been perpetrating this type of colonial violence, and with multiple reports to say that prove that. And more from your politicians. Google articles on how non-Indigenous Canadians can become allies. Go to the Calgary Foundation. They have an ally toolkit that you can utilize. Go to aboriginalalert.ca to find out all of the missing Indigenous people we're looking for. Missing Children's Society of Canada, they also have an email sign up that you can find out elderly, adults with disabilities. It's really important that we start supporting each other. And I think that drugdatadecoded.ca is an excellent resource by our former guest, Ewan Thompson. Does amazing work there. So please sign up for those emails as well. The National Overdose Response Service, 188-688-NORS for support. If you know someone using substances, do not use alone. You can download the NORS, Brave, Doors, and Lifeguard apps to help you, but the Doors app is Alberta only, and apparently they're not transparent with that information. I strongly support Freedom's Path Recovery Society.ca, where you can donate. They provide free one-on-one addictions counseling, group treatment for recovery, are queer-friendly and anti-racist. Many of you have heard I also support stonewallrecovery.ca. If you're experiencing emotional distress after anything we talked about, need to talk, you can call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 855-242-3310. Go to hopeforwellness.ca. If more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, you can go to 844-413-6649. And then there's also the 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Alberta at ssisa.ca. Of course, those scoops are still happening today because of racism. Indian Residential School Survivors and Family Hotline is 866-925-4419. Kids Help Phone is 1-800-668-6868. You can also text at 686868. The Native Youth Crisis Hotline is 877-209-1266. You can also go to youthline.ca for the LGBTQ youth line and text at 647-694-4275. Most places have a functioning 211. You can also call 988, text 988, or go to 988.ca. If you're in Toronto and you call 211, you actually get to have an Indigenous-led crisis response. This pilot is led by the Two-Spirited People of First Nations. So if you go to the number 2, spirits.org, you can find out more about that. For my American friends with Two-Spirit identity, you can go to strongheartshelpline.org or call 1-844-7-NATIVE. itgetsbettercanada.org has tons of resources, as you can see with Danielle Smith anti-trans legislation and the amount of organizations speaking out against it. They do not practice anti-racism nor have Indigenous education. So you may want to try the MMIWG2 line if you are Indigenous. Violence is my everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation faces it. This is self-care, how I take my power back. That's why I started the podcast, to speak freely without interruption, tone police, leadership shaming, gaslighting questions. Many people don't want to hear our Indigenous opinion, but they sure like to tell us theirs, usually by people who know nothing about Indigenous people, colonialism, constant surveillance by the public, by the police, at our vigils that are everywhere. Learn about being trauma informed. Learn why it's so hard for us as Indigenous people to trust you. Folks like me are dealing with internalized racism. There are gatekeepers out there that actually survive off of this, and folks who are really in their trauma and deplete a lot of personal resources. Internal and external racism is an everyday reality for me, other oppressed groups, folks with disabilities, QT, BIPOC. Masicho to my ancestors, to my granny, to my mom, what strength looks like through your example. I want to thank my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, my stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is, but most of all, my husband for producing and editing this show. On top of being my husband, childhood friend, and father of our child, and support down my journey of the Red Road, he has witnessed decades of racism and sexism. To our child, you teach me to be a stronger person. You give me daily accountability. And I'm honored you chose us. I honor the Blackfoot as the elders and members have been kind to me on my journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Blackfoot. Leonard Kenny taught me how to pronounce it in Satu Dene. My humblest apologies to the elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. I now have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. You can go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. And lastly, I want to end with side-eye to those Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not Tradish. My beautiful cousin would respond, or you'd be in my dish. Thank you folks for listening.